Hello, I'm Madeline Rosenberg, Public Humanities Specialist at the Princeton Public Library, and it's my pleasure to introduce this program, What the Constitution Means to Me, a pop-up book club and community conversation. I want to start by thanking you for taking the time to view this recording. I also want to thank McCarter Theater, our partner on this event. This program is presented with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This hybrid event runs for about 90 minutes. It begins with a panel from our 4 special guest commentators, followed by an opportunity for audience members, both in person and virtually, to ask questions. Please note that the commentators' presentations and audience Q&A from the original event were live-streamed to the live virtual audience. The live stream ended before the community conversation, with those at home using a discussion guide we provided in advance. Due to technical difficulties we experienced during the live event, we have re-recorded certain portions of the original program, including this introduction and the presentation by our first special guest commentator. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Paula Alexson, McCarter's Artistic Engagement Manager. Paula, shown in the original recording, introduces our guest commentators and facilitates the program. Thank you.
Paula Alexson, McCarter's Artistic Engagement Manager. McCarter and the Princeton Public Library love working with one another to create opportunities to engage folks from the local communities, to create meaningful opportunities to engage minds and hearts and spirits, and to have meaningful conversations about art and culture. When we knew Heidi Schreck's What the Constitution Means to Me was announced to be a part of McCarter's 2021-22 season, we knew that we were going to do something together, McCarter and the Princeton Public Library. After all, it has the word Constitution in it. And good gracious, Heidi Schreck was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. But what was the right format or type of event to have for this sneak peek opportunity to herald in this direct-from-Broadway production? When Madeline and Janie and I scheduled the Zoom meeting to plan it, I think we all thought it was rather cut and dry, a panel discussion. You know, constitutional scholars and historians. But we had to actually meet twice to figure it out. At first, we couldn't sort of find consensus on who the right panelists were and what the major questions or themes we wanted to explore with them might be. So we met again. And between meetings, though I had taught the play about 6 months before to my adult school class, I read it again. And actually, this wasn't just my second reading, more like my 4th or 5th. And that reading reminded me of something about the experience of reading Heidi Schreck's What the Constitution Means to Me. And that is, at least in my experience, that this play becomes, in the reading of it, an intensely personal experience. So when we met initially to create our event, Madeline had just read the play, and there was such a force of energy around the experience of the play that was exuding from her. It was incredible to even be in the Zoom room with her because so much energy and thought was churned up, and there was so much excitement she showed about the ideas of the play that she wanted to share. And her reading, her ideas were so different from my ideas and my thoughts about what I wanted to share. Exciting and equally valid, intensely personal. We could have talked for hours. And that's when I asked Madeline and Janie to sort of bear with me in the idea, the suggestion that maybe our event didn't want to be a panel, but maybe it would have wanted to be a book club opportunity. Now, I'm a firm believer in the concept that drama is written for performance and that a play is only complete when it is experienced in live performance. But there is something about the experience of this play on the page. We decided to invite our readers into that experience. But we also thought, how incredibly cool would it be if we also had the other people on the list of panelists that we had compiled to ask them to come and join us as readers as well as special guest commentators for the book club. And I thank them all for saying yes. It's my great honor and a true pleasure to introduce our special guest commentators. Laura F. Edwards is the class of 1921 bicentennial professor in the history of American law and liberty at Princeton University and affiliated scholar with the American Bar Foundation. She focuses on the legal history of the 19th century United States with an emphasis on people's interaction with the law and the legal system. And her lecture courses include a history of American democracy, U.S. legal history, and women, gender, and sexuality in U.S. history, to name only a few. She is also the author of 4 books, and a 5th is on the way. Her book, The People and Their Peace, Legal Culture and the Transformation on Inequality in the Post-Revolutionary South, was awarded the American Historical Association's Littleton Griswold Prize for the best book in law and society, and an award from the Southern Historical Association for best book in Southern history. Joy Barnes-Johnson, Dr. Joy, is a progressive science educator. At Princeton High School, she teaches mostly chemistry and earth science and includes the lens of equity into the science learning space. She is also a racial justice literacy educator and consultant and the co-creator of the first Princeton High School racial literacy course. She was awarded in 2019 the New Jersey Education Association's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Human and Civil Rights Award. This is an important recognition of her advocacy and achievement in equity and justice. Jill Dolan is Dean of the College and Anand Professor of English and Professor of Theater in the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. She's the author of many books, including most recently a book on playwright Wendy Wasserstein, as well as The Feminist Spectator as Critic, The Feminist Spectator in Action, and the award-winning blog, The Feminist Spectator. For anyone who has enrolled in performance studies classes on the undergraduate or graduate level in the past 3 decades, we jump, that includes me, obviously, we jump with excitement and bows in gratitude at the mere mention of Jill's name. And she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2016. And finally, Karen Thompson. She is the senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey, where she works on a wide range of issues, both civil and criminal, with a particular focus on racial inequality and criminal justice. She litigates in trial and appellate courts and advocates in partnership with community organizations around New Jersey. She's been named the 2021 Attorney of the Year by the New Jersey Law Journal. And interestingly, Karen Thompson, has a graduate degree in performance studies, which is neither a prerequisite for Attorney of the Year or for this event, but it is icing on the cake. And the whipped cream on the icing of the cake is that Karen also knows Heidi Schreck personally. We're so glad to have all 4 of these wonderful special guest commentators with us. And it occurs to me as I turn this event over to them that I have introduced them through the lens of their professional resumes, but I'm just grateful to have them here as readers, as people, to share their experience of reading as people.
So I want to say what a pleasure it is to be here tonight to talk about this incredibly compelling play. And I want to thank everybody who's made this possible, and also thank all the other speakers. I'm really looking forward to this. And this play spoke to me in a particular way because of what I do in my teaching and my research on law and legal history in the United States. So I have taught a survey in U.S. legal history since the late 1990s, and the U.S. Constitution is always one of the assigned documents, as you might imagine. So when students read it, though, they read it with the first set of amendments that became the Bill of Rights, so it's that package. The response has always been the same, and it doesn't really vary over time. And this response is one of surprise. Many admit that they've never actually read the document, but even those who have are still surprised. So why? I thought about this a lot, and I think that it's because before this class, even for those who've read the US Constitution, it existed for them more as an abstraction, as a revered but empty vessel into which they could pour pretty much whatever they wanted. But in class, they have to read the Constitution as an actual text, as real words on a real page. And in that form, they find that it does not always do what they thought that it did, or that they would like it to do. So in general, they had thought that it outlined the principles that define what it means to be an American. But actually what the Constitution does is lay out the structure of government and outline what that government cannot do. Now, for some students, surprise ultimately gives way to disbelief. And they're thinking, this can't be all there is because it's not enough. And then for a few more, disbelief gives way to a sense of betrayal, as in, this can't be because I need this document to do more. Now, this betrayal can be kind of a flash that's expressed in the moment and then confined there. But it can also be a slow burn that grows hotter over the semester as we consider legislation and cases, and it becomes clear that more often than not, interpretations of the US Constitution have stood in the way of efforts to achieve equality and substantive change in a variety of areas. So the betrayed students often end up arguing that the outcomes here are not really what the Constitution should be about. And yet, in history, as we discuss in class, these outcomes are exactly what was intended. Legislators, judges, lawmakers were observing the Constitution's limits. They were doing what it said, what government ought not to do. And that, for me, is a teaching moment, because we can get to the underlying issues in the course. And in this course, I'm asking students to come to terms with the relationship between human agency and the structural foundations of law, the ideas of law, the institutions in which it operates. So we make the law and interpret it, we the people, yet the law that we make acquires a life of its own and is not completely malleable once we set it in motion. It shapes what we can do and how we can do it, even as it requires our participation for its power. And I think that knowing what we're dealing with makes it possible to deal with all of that. And that is the goal of the course, ultimately. So as a teacher, I sympathize with my students' emotions, their surprise, their disbelief, their sense of betrayal, just as I sympathize with people's emotions in the past. I, though, as a historian, am trained to avoid them myself. I am trained to be an observer, not a participant. And what this play, what the Constitution means to me, did was turn me into a participant. In fact, I was so overwhelmed at one point in my reading that I had to put it down and for a while and come back to it later. I'm not used to feeling that way. And the play does what I cannot do in my course, because my course is about history. It's about what is past, not what we are doing now. There's a distance there. The play, though, invites the Constitution into our lives, into my life, making what, for me, for most other people, is a distant abstraction into something immediate and concrete. It forces us to grapple with the implications and the emotions of all of that. And I think the immediacy is necessary, particularly in this moment. It was good for me, certainly. It highlights the Constitution's power while also putting it within our reach so that we can discuss change and we can discuss what we might want to do with this thing that constructs our whole governing order. So as a historian, I want to emphasize the importance of that. And importance of the way that this puts the Constitution in our hands, the way that it asks us what it means to us and what challenges we should consider when we're thinking of making changes to it. That immediacy is really important. And that also is in keeping with the Constitution's history. Because the US Constitution that we know today, it didn't exist in the past. The US Constitution has actually changed dramatically over time in the way that it appears and structures our lives. So our view of it has also changed dramatically over time. What we expect of it has changed over time. Although we now intend to emphasize continuity over change, in fact, change is very much present in the Constitution's history. So a few words on that. My work focuses on the century following the American Revolution. For most people at that time, the US Constitution mattered only insofar as it did so little for them. It set up a constitutional order that actually gave states and localities authority over most of the major issues in most people's lives. In fact, most of those issues, from social welfare to economic regulation, were handled at the local level in counties and municipalities, and not even at the state level. The US Constitution was literally out of most people's reach. The rights enumerated in it at that time applied only in federal cases. It was interpreted that way, only federal cases, of which there were very few, which meant that those constitutional rights were really inconsequential to most people, even the white propertied men who could claim rights. So for these men, even, the rights that really mattered were those in state constitutions. States, for instance, even defined the meaning of citizenship, not the federal government. What constituted the core meaning of that? That belonged to the states. Now, that said, the rights outlined in states did not have the valence or power that they do today either. They were contingent on concerns involving the public good, which always took precedence over individual claims. So you may have a right, but it was always interpreted in terms of what that meant in terms of its effects on the larger public order. Now, of course, what constituted the public good varied wildly from place to place. Some states, for instance, saw slavery as necessary for the public good. Others did not and abolished it. But then there were other decisions that were also made at the local level, interpretations of these broad sort of state level determinations. And at the local level, decisions could fall out in ways that checked the authority of white propertied men and gave those without rights some access to the legal system. Sometimes it worked out that way, sometimes not. It was very contingent on all these local specificities, the personalities in play, the particular context, the issues involved. Now, in all this unevenness, there was some consistency as well. All states, for instance, kept coverture, which denied rights to married women, although this too was interpreted differently, more loosely at the local level. So in this iteration of our constitutional order, law was not uniform from place to place within the United States, which had positives and negatives. But that meant that you couldn't move with your rights. You couldn't move with your status from place to place. A person of African descent was presumed to be free in one place, but enslaved in another. Who they were depended on, and what their rights were, status was, depended on where they were in the country. And similarly, coverture could be interpreted in such a way that married women could own property in one community, but if they tried to take that to another community, that wouldn't be the place. This looseness, this flexibility had pluses and minuses. But for those who had problems with any of these determinations at the state and local level, that was it. It was too bad if you didn't like it. There was no place to appeal. The federal government could not help. Now, the Civil War and Reconstruction put in place amendments to the Constitution that began a transformation in this constitutional order and our expectations of it. Those amendments and subsequent changes gave the federal government more power in determining the laws that define our status and define our rights. As power migrated there to the federal level, the text of the US Constitution also became more important. It had the power now to override other legal texts and practices at the state and at the local level that had once defined the constitutional order. The text of the Constitution, the federal government became more important. Now, some of those changes were intended to make this whole governing order more responsive to more people. Although, of course, it did not always work out that way, suggesting that change does not always have the intended results, nor does it always take the form of a progressive arc. Now, our expectations changed as well here. We now see ourselves as a nation, not a collection of localities or states. We expect uniform laws that apply to us all. We expect that the federal government will be involved in those laws in some way. We look there for justice, and we assume that that was always the case, but it was not. And that should give us pause when we think about change today. If collectively we made such profound changes to our constitutional order in the past, then we can do it again. And in fact, as a historian, I say that we can't avoid it. if nothing else, change is always there. We're always going to have to be grappling with it, and pretending that it's not there and that we can just continue on as we always have is to avoid the obvious. So we should take charge and try to direct those changes ourselves. And in fact, our current obsession with the text of the US Constitution and our insistence on seeing it as this treasured heirloom, unchanged from the past, is actually an outcome of changes to our constitutional order. And at the same time, it is an impediment to shaping its future. So thank you.
So much beautiful insight. And I'm going to walk back from some of the key points that Lauren made and then take you to where I sit in this text. So one of the last things that you said was that we think about the Constitution like an heirloom. Well, I got an immediate image.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I feel like the heavy here.
What happened?
Does she need the mic at all? Just hold the handheld mic if you don't mind.
Okay.
You need to turn off her mic. Yeah, she has a button that'll turn it
Okay,
off
okay.
so that they don't speak. So should everyone, just so that we have a flow. Thank you. Sorry, everyone. Sorry,
We did test this all, but something always happens.
All right, just give it to me. Okay, friend.
Give it to me.
Give it to me. We're
Thank
gonna collect
you.
them all.
Thank you. Technology is wonderful until it isn't.
Thank you.
Yes.
Agreed. Thank you, sorry.
Yes.
Okay, start again.
All right. So from the beginning. So one of the beautiful things, insights that Lauren just made was that we treat the Constitution like an heirloom. And I got an immediate image because I think about trinkets, I think about relics, I think about symbols and mementos of people who had value and valuable things, and they wanted to somehow pass it on. And I think at how few heirlooms exist in communities of color that get passed on. And yet the responsibility to embrace this symbol is all of ours. And I'm like, And then I think about how I came to understand the Constitution, and as a teacher, how I wanted students to begin to embrace this heirloom. And I think about teaching them the preamble, because that's the way I learned it. Before I knew anything about the Bill of Rights, I heard and had to remember, we the people of the United States, in order to form a perfect union, blah, blah, blah. All the rest fell apart quickly in my 13-year-old mind, my 15-year-old mind, my 21-year-old mind, my 50-year-old mind, because that part, right, the perfect union part, which falls apart because A, there is no such thing as perfect, and we certainly have not been unified in my lifetime. And then I say, okay, a portion of the text that says, how many amendments have been passed in your lifetime? And I said, okay, 2. That's crazy, right? That's crazy. To think that this document, at the point at which it was written, 236 years, now 245 years, 2 amendments have been passed in my lifetime. And I'm saying to myself, okay, what are they? Voting at 18, and the one that came after that. Okay? And I'm like, okay. So what's that mean exactly? Because in the end, I think the most arresting recollection here was Amendment 9. That is, that the forefathers said, now there's going to be some stuff that happens that we're certain we haven't thought about it yet. And so we're going to put this in here to cover it. And that sits within the Bill of Rights. So oftentimes when, as a Black person, the constitutional conversation for Black people, for brown people, is the 13th Amendment, got it. And then you get to that tagline, except for as punishment for crimes. And then you're like, so we have not fully abolished slavery, got it. Then you get the 14th. And the idea that the 14th is written just beyond the Emancipation Proclamation, because Abraham Lincoln knew there was going to need to be some backup for the 13th. Okay? And then it continues from that point. And then I go back to, well, okay, Joy, what does this all mean? And so one of my favorites, again, I'm going to go from the end back to the beginning, because I think the things at the end pulled everything together for me. And one of the lines at the end said, you know, in order for things to change, we have to learn to trust. We have to learn to trust the process, trust the people writing these policies, trust the document. But the reality of it is this: traumatized people have trust issues. And so we have been traumatized by this document. And regardless of any pretense that may have existed to be the guiding force in the land of the free, we've been traumatized by it. And so I said, yes. And I think about it all the time. And so there's new context for me. That line that we have to learn to trust, and then my own thinking, traumatized people have trust issues. And then I go back and I realize at 50, almost 51 years old, I am the first generation in my family to be born free from a constitutional perspective, free to vote, right? Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, I came through a couple of years after that. And so my own mother was not born with that right, nor her mother, nor my grandmother's father, who I knew, born in 1890 something. His mother hadn't experienced physical freedom at all. And so this idea that as free people, our rights should travel with us. Oh, that's deep for me. Because I'm like this. Their rights did not travel with them. Whether I consider my great-grandfather, who I did know, born in 1890 something, or my grandmother, born in 1920 something, or my mother, born in 1940 something. Man, right? And so I said to myself, that's what this is about. What does the Constitution mean to me? It's about who gets to be free. Who gets to be free? Who gets to imagine freedom, realizing that the speakers in this recognize that they're not really free. So then, okay, going back, I thought next about how Heidi is in conversation with who Heidi was at 15 and who Heidi is as an adult, in conversation with other people at various stages in their life, and how the stage is set with three primary voices on the stage and then the audience, realizing that it is the value of that transaction between the listening audience, the responding audience, the voices in our head, in our hearts, and the voice that actually occupies the room. So I said, okay, at 15, I was listening to Madonna, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Duran Duran. And I was like, the 80s were wonderful. MTV, here we go, right? And imagining now as a high school teacher, the 15-year-old girls and boys and others that I teach, and realizing what they're listening to and how it is shaping the way that they understand their freedoms, their liberties, and what the Constitution might mean to them. And how much more agency they have, and how much bigger their bondage is. And I'm saying to myself, holy mackerel, the anxieties that I had at 15 were so not what they are dealing with right now at 15. And yet, we've all been traumatized. And so we have this very difficult time trusting. So then I said, okay, so what brings Heidi at 15 to the stage and realized that her feminist mother said, you're gonna get up there and make some money, some scholarship. You're going to be educated and you're going to learn to communicate freely and openly in spite of whatever else is going on internally. Externally, the world will see you as a well-read, well-spoken reciter of important things. And I said, oh my God, that's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure. And then traveling around to these contests with the Legionnaire, I said, no, the Legionnaires, the closest thing I could think of was the Lions Club, right? And I know what that looked like. And so I said to my goodness, yeah, I can imagine.
Oh my God.
Right.
Lions Club is commercial.
Yeah. The Lions Club is like,
I'll tell you later.
yeah, well, so that's the thing. That's the thing. In my head, I knew what the Lions Club looked like, so I could only imagine what this could have been, must have been. And I sit there and I say, hoo-wee, to even keep an audience. Again, understanding the juxtaposition of the audience of the 15-year-old Heidi and the audience watching this performance. And how the first gave nothing back but austere glance, maybe a crinkled brow. And I said, that's crazy, right? And then I moved on back to the front. As you can see in my book, I bent up a whole bunch of pages. And then at first I was like, no, don't write on it. Then I said, Joy, just write on it, right? Make it a script for yourself to think about. And so then on page 13, it says, this is the actual book I used to prepare for the contest, Your Rugged Constitution. It's fantastic. These are little cartoons that explain all the amendments to you. It's endorsed by Herbert Hoover. And I said, ooh, right? But again, as a teacher, I'm thinking, how do you make something that is so difficult to digest, not only digestible, but palatable? Make it accessible, other than to put it in cartoon for someone like Herbert Hoover, right? This is profound to me. In what year? 1954. Say what? That's amazing. My mother was just a little girl, and I thought to myself about the mother in the story and how my mother, born in 1940 something, if we were in the car and she thought I was pregnant at 15, what would she have done? When Herbert Hoover is the one endorsing the book that told about the Constitution. And so I say that when I went through and looked at this, first as a science person, so I wear several hats as a teacher. I teach science, earth science and chemistry most of my day. I have my cup filled by my students in every class that I teach because they force me to consider not only what the Constitution means to me, but what every historical document, every piece of information about everything means to me. When I teach during the day, I happen to be one very colorful educator in their life, out of very few that look like me. But very few also act like me, and then very few have had experiences like me. And so this brings me to my last point, and that in the very beginning, opening up the very first few pages, I was thrust back into the 80s. And if you were a child of the 80s like me, Fame was on TV, Flashdance was making lots of money, MTV was brand new, and everyone wanted fame. But we knew that it cost, and we were going to pay in sweat, right? So this idea of theatrics and aesthetics and understanding the setting was important, because now all of a sudden the actors are not the only people on the stage. It's the Constitution as a script It's the lighting. It's the bell ringer. It's everything about the way it's staged and sort of understanding the sociological imagination of actors on a stage in the dark, seated back to back with a table and index cards when it was time for you to poop, right? And I said to my friend as I was reading this, he said, Joy, we were the first generations in our family to be free. And I thought about my son, who was the first in my family to be allowed to get a degree in the arts. Whereas when it was my turn to go to school, it's like, you want to be a what? A dancer? Oh, come on. Now, what are you really going to do? And so that freedom to be able to explore the arts and look at theater and look at film and look at stories as a way to free yourself from the trauma, man, that's what I took. And I enjoyed every aspect from the beginning to the end, the alternate ending, and clearly wondering, what does this actor look like? Does she look like me? And saying to myself, man, there's a lot here that every teacher and parent, I believe, should share with their 15-year-old selves. And that's great. Looking forward.
Thank you so much. I'm unmasking as well. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, everyone who organizes. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Karen. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about a play that I love. I'll just start by saying I love this play. And I read it as a feminist spectator, which you heard from my bio. That's basically who I am and what I do. So even when I'm reading, I think about the play, not just as dramatic literature, but something that's really a roadmap to the live production. As Heidi Schreck says so well in the play, it's a blueprint for an experience that she wants people to have in the theater. So I was lucky enough to see the Broadway production of the play in 2019 with Heidi Schreck in the lead. And I thought it might be helpful to just share my responses to you in the moment of seeing the play, as well as then rereading it for the purposes of this group, of this book group. I want to hit on 3 topics for you that I hope will be generative. One is just a few things about women and Broadway and performance and theater and what that means. 2, what I think is really important about the play's context and its form, the way that the story is told as a theatrical event. And then finally, a few things about the play's content as well, which Laura and Joy have talked about quite a lot, and why it matters to me as a theater person and a theater critic. So just a few things to situate it in the history, really, of theater. It opened on Broadway in 2019. It was developed, though, at a number of downtown, off Broadway theater spaces that are very well known, actually, for developing plays, especially by women, especially by people of color, especially by queer people, by a lot of people who typically you don't see their plays produced on Broadway. They're very good at developing these plays, but rarely do they transfer. So it was huge that this play transferred to Broadway. Plays by and about women remain, even after years of feminist agitation to the contrary, not very frequently seen on Broadway. This is not the work that most often still gets produced. And that's despite the fact that the research shows that it's typically women who decide what they're going to see when they go to Broadway, and they're the ones who buy the tickets for shows. So in other words, the play was already a gamble to move from downtown New York to Broadway. The final thing about this is that Heidi Schreck is a very well-known playwright and performer in downtown spaces, but she had never before performed on Broadway or in film or in television. And typically, when you're casting a Broadway show, if you want to attract audiences, you often cast people who are familiar because they performed either on Broadway or in other genres, like Mary Louise Parker, who was in a play called The Sound Inside, Jeff Daniels in To Kill a Mockingbird, or lots of other examples of this. So it was a real gamble for this play to move to Broadway, and very exciting for me as a feminist theater critic to even mark that had happened, period. Then in terms of the context and the form of the play, first the form. For those of you who are theater goers or readers, you know, the play was unusual for Broadway for lots of other reasons, one of which is that in theater speak, we would say Heidi breaks the fourth wall, right? Instead, by speaking directly to the audience. So instead of presuming, as much theater does, that the audience is looking in on the space in which the characters and actors never acknowledge that they're there, this play, as you can see, is very much about acknowledging the co-presence of the performer and the spectator, and actually inviting the audience to kind of make the play or make the meaning of the experience they're having together with Heidi. Also, much of the performance isn't set. I love the fact that in the published play, they published the two different versions of the ending where Heidi and her high school interlocutor are on opposite sides of this debate about whether or not to abolish the Constitution. I love that partly because everything should be less determinate than often it is, and because it's such a good example of how to argue both sides of a question and be the same person doing so. It kind of implies that arguments can be inhabited differently by different people, and that we can see different endings even in a Broadway scene. That said, that is highly not typical for a Broadway production, which are often very locked down. They happen the same every night, except of course for the more typical interactions with spectators, which does change the actor's experience of the play. But this sense that the performance changes every night, the way she invites you to see it change in the written text, is unusual for the Broadway context. And then, most importantly for me, what it means to see a woman command a Broadway stage the way that Heidi Schreck does in this performance with the two other members of the cast, but she mostly drives the play. It's her presence and her charisma that really encourages you into this world that she's made. I find that enormously important, not just for women in theater. I love that at one point in the play she says, "I love this contest. It made me believe that people would listen to me when I spoke." There's something about being a woman on a Broadway stage where people kind of have to listen to you when you're speaking that's quite remarkable historically and quite powerful. And of course raises the question about who we are willing to listen to speak, whether in a theater context or in a legal context or in a political context. So I love the way that very implicitly she uses the occasion of the form of exactly what she's doing to raise questions about how this works in other areas of human life. Her involvement with the audience, which Joy mentioned, you know, not only does she break the fourth wall, but she explicitly asks us to see her seeing us. So that the whole exchange of the play is really about a mutual acknowledgement of co-presence and respect for it. You might have noticed when reading the play the number of times she says thank you and you're welcome to the audience, which is a very subtle acknowledgement, but it's also enormously polite. And I love that she critiques the politeness of her own white womanness throughout the play, but there's also something very civil about how polite she is to the audience, that she does thank people. This is no longer typical, I would hazard to say, in public forums, this kind of politeness when we are interlocutors with one another. And as such, I think the play is really exemplary of its kind of utopian wish for establishing other ways of speaking with one another about important issues like women's rights and the Constitution. I love, too, that audience participation plays such an important role in the play in deciding who wins the debate at the end. Of course, analogously, audience participation, not just participation in general, plays an enormous role in democracy. So when they encourage the audience to be loud and show your approval or disapproval about which side of this argument you want to win, that too sets an example. We should be loud as citizens. We should show our approval and disapproval. So I love that she kind of uses the occasion of theater for what many theater critics and theorists have called a kind of rehearsal for democracy, or a rehearsal for revolution, that in this space of the audience on that particular night, we're rehearsing for other ways of being together as citizens in the world. She says in the play, democracy is something we have to make happen. We have to fight for every single day. And that process, she begins by this invitation to do so in the theater. And then finally, the importance of the content of the play. I'll just say a few things here because there's so much to say. But often work by women in the theater and films, in cultural representation in general, is often derided for not being universal enough. We can all watch plays and read novels by men, and especially white men and straight men, but watching a play by a woman, a person of color, a queer person, I'm not sure that's going to be universal enough, is an argument that's still, even in this day and age, held up against plays like this one. What I think Schreck does so well in the play is to make her argument specifically about a very gendered experience and a very personal experience, while pointing out that even the Constitution of the United States is not a universal document, that's part of the argument of the play, that the Constitution is one that itself works to the advantage of a very particular set of people, however they might change over the course of history. So she takes this founding document that we assume is universal, fills it with very particular women's and personal experiences as a way of quarreling with this notion that women's stories aren't universal stories, which I think is very important. She intertwines the personal and the political in really important ways. This, of course, is an old chestnut of feminist theory and practice, but she uses that not just to ground her experience in her own authority, but to suggest that it is personal experience of a variety of kinds that make up the fabric of what the Constitution, of the lives to which the Constitution refers, and puts those in dialogue. Two more content issues that I think are important. The way she uses time in the play, so that she says about the set, the place is filled with ghosts. You see all the pictures of the Legionnaires on the wall. But it welcomes the living, she says, and there's a live plant over in the corner of the set that represents that. There's so many references in the play to seeing the future in the past. There's this sense, she actually says in the play, that progress doesn't only move one way, that it goes backwards and forwards. She learns a lot from younger people, for whom she says, sometimes I feel like you're shining a light backwards into the darkness so that I can follow you into the future. I love how she thinks about time in this very, very present moment of what she calls nowness. And then finally, all the references in the play to our common humanity, to being a human being. She insists on us being human beings to one another in ways that she believes so profoundly can be ameliorating. She convinces, when she's having that fantasy about the murderer and rapist, not to hurt her. She says, I'm going to convince them that I'm a human being so that they'll see me that way and not hurt me. When she talks about the Jessica Gonzalez case, she points out how often they refer to the word shall instead of ever referring to the woman whose case it is as a human being. And then finally, the set of questions that the audience poses to her and her high school interlocutor at the end of the play are about them getting to know one another as human beings. So that again roots the play in the sense of a kind of quotidian but really profound experience of everydayness and personalness that I think she argues is just as important as our interrogations of the Constitution, and that it ends always with this young African-American girl being asked to think about her future, to sort of project herself and her experience into the future. I think it's just very moving and lovely. I love this play. I hope you'll go see it. Over to you, Karen. Thank you.
Oh gosh, okay. She had a panic attack. I think this play is haunted, and so I want to talk about the ghosts. There is a need when we talk about the Constitution to talk about what it's doing. And obviously it is our operating instructions for the country, but it is also a very carefully manicured and maintained role of white supremacy and patriarchy. The laws are made. They're made by judges, they're made by lawyers, they're made by people who bend it to fit. But what falls out of that are the bodies. What falls out of it are the stories that never get told, the people who never got to go to the courtrooms, those who didn't get to see the traveling judges, those who are locked away by police misconduct, by prosecutorial misconduct, and who are never the actual recipients. And so one of the beautiful things that I think Heidi does is she allows for that space of haunting and all of the voices that are not there to be made flesh in us and in how we think about the law. And that hits me in a very, very intense way. And when I also saw it on Broadway, and I think there's a different hit when you're in the room and you're seeing her kind of physically embody it versus the reading of it. And it's that kind of split that I'm talking about. I think the book of the play feels more haunted than when she's there in front of you, because it's that interplay between the corporeal part of it with all of these spirits. And she talks about the penumbras. That is, we need penumbras, right? That's how we have Row. There's many reasons why penumbras are important, but penumbras are also spectral. And so I think that one of the things I love about it is she gives me permissions when I enter courtrooms, because when I enter them, I'm not expected to be there. I'm often assumed to be a spectator or a defendant, but not actually someone there to do the law. So for much of my career, the law did not feel like it was mine. And part of what I love about this play is that she makes the law belong to all of us. And that feels like a huge gift, even in its impossibilities. And so when she talks about Scalia and Breyer arguing about shall, what they're really doing is absenting the people who are the central part of the conversation from the conversation where they've already been dismissed by the law. And so again, as a lawyer, as my work is done in New Jersey courts, I try very hard in every single argument to talk about the person who has been harmed. And New Jersey is a very funky place legally. It's very, very odd. And I'm new to the state. I come from New York. I still live in New York. And I was 7 years at the Innocence Project, where I was doing a very different kind of law. So when I came to New Jersey and I got to kind of get deep into the weeds of how the state operates, it is deeply, deeply utopian. I know that sounds very strange, but the Constitution is the state Constitution is actually very permissive. We have amazing statutes, a law against discrimination, the New Jersey Civil Rights Act, which really puts a very strong thumb on the scale of those who have been harmed by the government, right? So there are these beautiful things that give so much room. The Attorney General can issue directives that serve as law. They're basically legal precepts from the Attorney General that can make things more fair in a snap. You don't have to go through the legislature. You don't have to have appeal after appeal. The Attorney General can make it so, right? So there are these very magical elements of New Jersey, but New Jersey was also one of the last states to sign on to the 13th Amendment. Yeah. New Jersey fought to get freed slaves sent back to Africa, right? And so in that mix and that kind of slurry, this kind of internal struggle, comes this beautiful way to practice here, this beautiful emergence in the courtrooms. And I am so inspired by making those spaces real in the ways that she's telling us that they already live in us. All of the kind of damage of being excluded also give us the ability to see what it is that we want to create, what we want to bring into reality. And so I there's some language here that I just, like you said, you had to put it down and then you have to read it over. And one of the things that I love that she says is that her mother, who'd inherited centuries of belief in her own worthlessness, had to have that led to her thinking of having a constitution like the first mother, right? Not the mother who is born out of this worthlessness, not the grandmother who kind of denies her own children's trauma, which is in itself a protective act, but the mother who can hold it. And so I'm not trying to chase the ghosts away, because it's not bad to be haunted, right? And in the haunting, we remember and we heal it. And we embrace those histories. And so I feel like I'm being a little bit random, but it's in some ways it sits in an emotional space for me that is, that the law doesn't even allow. Because in those spirits, this play makes me feel like a very whole lawyer. It makes me feel like the invitation into the courtroom, like my presence in the courtroom, is not a fantasy, but is what is necessary to perfect this Constitution, to perfect this union that we are all trying to get through. So.
I cannot thank each of you enough for what you have shared with us, and Karen, the beauty of that. Thank you. You have me in tears, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. And now we segue, before we send our friend off for a little rest in preparation for the Supreme Court in New Jersey tomorrow, to our audience's questions. I have a question already, so I'm going to go and get it.
Hi, thank you.
Oh, hold on for 1 second, my friend. We want to make sure everyone gets to hear it. It's okay.
Thank you enormously, of course, for your generous, thoughtful remarks. I had no idea what to expect when I read this. No idea. And I'm struck right now that this Wednesday, the second only ever U.S. Solicitor General, woman Elizabeth Prelogar, who clerked with Elena Kagan and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Merrick Garland when he was judge. She will be arguing for the people. And the 14th Amendment is very much at the heart of what the Constitution means in the way it is presented by Schreck. And I'm wondering if any of you have any comments or thoughts on that particular part, that really almost a nexus to the substance, the content, apart from the wondrousness of the characters and the emotion. I'm just very struck by how immediate this is for all of us. This is the Mississippi case that will be argued a month ago. The first Monday after the Friday she was sworn in, Prelogar did the closing argument on the Texas case, not the substance, not the constitutional issues, but the process. So just any thoughts you might have on that. I'm just so struck by the immediacy of this.
Is that in anyone's wheelhouse?
I mean, I don't practice federally, but I think that.
Hold on for 1 second. Let me just make sure that you're heard, my friend.
I don't practice federally, but I think that if anything, if we've learned anything in the past 4 years, it is about the fragility of this very, very small document. And it is at once terrifying and also incredibly powerful that it has been able to bend and not break, and that there is something about the process of being tested that is, it's like forging it. It's getting, in some ways, made stronger. And I know it's a test, and I think that what we started to see with Texas, and you are talking about the abortion case, that I think what we're starting to see is that there are end runs around the Constitution. So it's called the shadow docket, where we're starting to see decisions being made procedurally, just like, oh, well, we're going to just refer that back, and we're just going to let that that hard stop just go, and you guys handle it. Like there's a way in which we're not even getting to the Constitution, where the penumbra is getting beyond the ninth. It's just becoming, it's like shadow theater, puppet theater. And I think that's a little bit terrifying, because when we start avoiding the requirements, when we start avoiding the obligations, it's all up in the air, becomes, just a food fight.
So yeah, the position of the 14th Amendment, and then also the focus here in the play on women, I think was haunting for me. As a historian, I live with ghosts a lot, so I like them too. But it is haunting in the sense that we're still dealing with this whole huge constitutional order, not just the U.S. Constitution from the 19th century, which made women's bodies fit subjects for public regulation in ways that men's bodies were not. And it didn't matter, women's bodies, it didn't matter if they were enslaved or free or white or black, all women's bodies were seen as a fit subject for public regulation. And the 14th Amendment did not change that, because the 14th Amendment did not extend rights to women, be they married, unmarried, white, black, whatever their status. In fact, were defined as not citizens. Hence, the 14th Amendment did not apply to them. So we're still kind of stuck here in this world that is very ambiguous, that Heidi Schreck is talking about, that she keeps coming back to in the context of this play. And I think she's also reminding us that there is this broader world out there that the US Constitution does not fix, this broader penumbra of legal decisions and practices and principles that, in fact, the US Constitution is ignoring and then provides no way to deal with or to fix, but in fact provides the ways out that you're talking about, procedurally, the shall mean. That we're not doing the substance there, because in fact, when you look at the Constitution, there is no way to deal with the substance really in that.
Thank you for that. We do have a question from our Crowdcast viewer. Where do you see the role of art in conversations about the Constitution? Thank you, question asker and answerer, Jill.
I would just say I see the role of art as enormously important and active in a conversation about just about anything, but obviously about politics at this moment. It's enormously important that we use the forum of the theater to stage those conversations in smart, empathetic, compassionate, respectful ways, as I think this play does.
I also, the question makes me think about the value of productions, very large productions like Hamilton, and how it's a reimagining using a creative and an artistic license that makes this very difficult document in history palatable and accessible. When we, in our racial literacy class, shout out Patty, when we teach in our aesthetics unit, we do and ask students to do what we call a triple read, which is you take whatever text, whatever print, poem, song, composition, play, and you read it. You understand who the author is, and that's your first read. Your second read is who influenced your author. Meaning, was it historical? Were events happening? Were people happening that you can see threads of these truths passing through their works? And then the final read is actually who that person influenced and how that work influenced others. And so the value of arts is imitation. And so when we have people reimagining the Constitution, whether it's Heidi Schreck or Lin-Manuel, what we're doing is we're giving people, a diversity of people, new language, new imagination, removing scales, and sort of opening up broader conversations that allow people to actually digest this heavy meal.
Thank you so much, Joy. Any questions from the audience in person here at the community room? Yes.
So I saw the play on Broadway too, and I haven't read it. And now that you're so enthusiastic, I'm going to. So thank you.
You can borrow that.
Tell the people online. Thank you. So I remember being frustrated in a way when I saw the ending of this marvelous play. And it's the exact same question that the library has posed to the people online. At the end, she says, well, we've just got to throw it out, the Constitution. And what would you do if you wanted to just throw it out? You have perfectly mentioned, all of you in different ways, that her answer to that was, well, we are the Constitution. We will change our laws. We will move forward. It's a living thing. But I get that. And of course, I was frustrated when I saw it at first because it's just a stupid question. I mean, I thought maybe she'd done it for heuristic value, just to shock and to get us thinking. Maybe that was true, which was a great device. But it's like the Beatles. Say you want a revolution, yeah, I'd like to see the plans. What are you going to replace it with? Which brings up the whole living Constitution point that I heard from you folks. But maybe it's a fair question. If you were going to throw it out, which is what she said to get us thinking and what the online people have been asked, what would you do?
I thought about that question. And I thought about it largely because as a high school teacher, I'm helping to shape agendas for generations, right? So students that get an opportunity to interact with me and hear what I have to say are going to determine their next step in college and life, and they're not as tainted yet, right, or traumatized by life. So what I love that is offered here is the conversation at the very end that there are 194 countries who have revised their constitution and had success. The idea that there are places where we can look and gather information about alternatives to some of the problematic language that we have right now and the lack of resources that we allow to oppress people and the predominance of white supremacy or supremacy in general as an ideology. So that's the question, what would I do? I would recalibrate the narrative of the United States of America and get people early to imagine that being from the United States does not mean that you are the best thing walking or the only winning team, and ask us to sort of pay closer attention to those who are grappling with diversity, grappling with supremacist and patriarchal ways of being, and who are embracing the disabled, the queer, the impoverished, and the gender nonconforming. Those who are winning at democracy, in my mind, because the democratic person embraces the known human. So what we have when we have supremacy at all, like what we have in the United States, right, is we have people being erased and being rendered invisible. And so that's what I would say, learn to see and not judge as if you're the only.
Imagine originalism would then become 2021 or something like that.
Well, and we also think of the U.S. Constitution as unique, that somehow it is, this perfect thing. And in fact, other countries write constitutions, and even in the context of the Age of Revolutions, when our Constitution was formed, it is unusual because it is all full of negative rights, what government can't do. France has positive rights, what you can claim. And we have examples within our own country with state constitutions that have a much more fulsome definition of rights of what you can claim. So we don't have to, it's not like we're throwing out, the entire thing and then starting from scratch with no models. We've been doing this for a long time within our own country even. And so the whole idea that somehow you throw it out and then you have nothing left strikes me as a false choice.
Can I say
I think the question that that the provocation of the question to abolish or not is really the question, how does change happen? And there's something about that gesture in the play that regardless of how you answer it, and in different versions, it's answered differently, the work has to continue. It's an invitation to keep doing the work, which I also appreciate about the play, all her little self-referential comments to, oh, that's another play that I'm working on, I'll tell you when it's done. But there is a sense that behind the work of this moment, of this play, there's much more work still to be done, which I think is analogous to what she wants us to think about the politics of the moment too.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that. I'm going to make that the final comment of this Crowdcast event. Thank you for those folks who are joining us on Crowdcast. We hope that you will use the discussion guide to have conversations yourself at home. We also hope that you all might consider joining us at McCarter to experience in person what the Constitution means to me, fully realized, made complete in live performance. The play will only be running for a very short time. It will open on Tuesday, December 7th, and run until Sunday, December 12th. Cassie Beck will be performing the role of Heidi in the play, and you can purchase tickets through McCarter's website at McCarter, MCCARTER.org.